Hello. Mic's not on.
The mic's up here.
Ah, so you're on mic today?
Yeah, sorry.
Kia ora. Welcome all, please. Thank you. And apologies to those on YouTube as online that was delayed start. There've been a few other meetings happening. So welcome all to Strategy and Planning. Today we've got apologies from Councillor Robertson. I'm having to move that seconded. Welcome Edward, who I think is joining us online. And we've also got online Dr. Gunn and Mary De Winter, sorry, who will be talking to us in the presentation section. In the meantime, we have Ray Carpet, who's come along to talk to us about some issues that he's concerned about. And thank you. Whenever you're ready, the floor is yours. You've got 5 minutes, and then I hope you'll take any questions.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Kate, for the opportunity to speak. And thanks generally to the council for the work they're undertaking as elected members. You must have a huge workload with what central government's throwing at the moment. I'm here because I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to speak at the long-term plan. There was just too much on. I was submitting on the climate change submission and on Plan Change 8, and there's just so much you can sort of fit into the day. It's no excuse, I know, but I do appreciate the chance for a quick ear here. In terms of the long-term plan, I fully support the views expressed by the farmers. I have a farm on the Taieri, part of the lower Taieri flood and drainage schemes, and particularly the sentiments expressed by Messrs Parks and Bryan. Why am I here? Well, I guess I'm an accountant by background, so I'd just like to illustrate, if I could, by numbers. In 2006, when I bought the farm on the Taieri, my rates were $7,300. This is all excluding GST. The 2022 predictor has them at $50,000. That's a 580% increase at an average of 15% a year. 13% next year alone. 55% increase in the 1 year 2012 when the targeted rating scheme was reviewed on the Taieri. The long-term plan, if the figures are right, would see my rates go up another $16,000 to $66,000 excluding GST. To put that in perspective, my insurance bill that covers all risks on the Taieri is $12,000. So to cover my flood and drainage issue, $66,000 versus insurance policy to cover all risks of $12,000. I'm currently paying just 25% less than an international airport, one farmer. In the West Taieri district where my farm's located, 20 farmers or 20 individual ratepayers have a burden of 46% of that rate. Just 20 people. 20 farmers or 20 ratepayers have the burden of 27% of the whole of the lower Taieri flood rates. So essentially, why I'm here is that there's been talk of, in the long-term planning process, a review of the way the rating scheme's levied, the setting up of liaison groups to deal with the issues. And I fully support that, along with farmer input into the review, and a review that's held independent of council executive and by someone that I think should be also approved by the stakeholders. On this note, I spoke to 3 councillors, including the chair, and got 3 different answers on what the current council position is on it. Nick Donnelly, thank you, Nick, supplied me the minute, which says that you're going to have something come back from staff to, I think, the implementation committee on 8th of September regarding liaison groups, and something back from staff on the review options by December. I guess my point is, each year that goes by, it's costing me more and more dollars. So my sense of urgency seems to be greater than what the council's is at the moment. I alerted council to this 3 years ago with an email to, or was it 3 or 2 years when the elections were on? I thought I might get a response because it was election year. I copied the CEO, I copied the CFO. I didn't get a response from anyone. So I'm feeling rather frustrated. Thankfully, Nick, after the second reminder, did come back to me. And so that's why I'm here speaking. So thank you.
And you're happy to take questions?
I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Ray. Anyone? Thank you, Councillor Laws.
Let me kick off, but play devil's advocate to you. You've complained about the cost and the escalating cost of providing this, but the private value to your farming enterprise and those who are paying the balance of the costs would seem to be proportionate, wouldn't it? That you are again having a private good from public funding.
No,
Therefore, pay more.
the floods that I've kind of received on my farm, I don't want to sound glib, but be inconsequential to me. I've got diverse business interests, and I compare that to if I was a resident, which I was in Mosgiel, where a lot of the drainage and flood schemes drain from. If I had a flood there that basically flooded my home, then I've got a real issue. So relative to the cost, the benefit I'm getting. In fact, I approached Nick about opting out of the scheme. He told me I couldn't do that. You know, I'd rather take self-insurance. What benefit am I really getting for $50,000 spent next year?
No, that's a legitimate question. So you would be connected with your local neighbours and fellow farmers.
Yep.
Is there a general view that opting out is a real likelihood for your crew, or rather maintaining the flood banks yourselves?
Yeah, I think if the farmers would be very happy taking over the assets and running it more efficiently. Now, performance, and I understand there's a performance review as well as how the levies are rated. But in our particular area, those 20 farmers, if I had a discussion with them, actually probably not 20 farmers because I think the airport's in that lot as well, I'm sure they'd be delighted and they would think that they could run the scheme a lot more efficiently.
Yeah, Councillor Carp.
So it sounds like a few things bundled up in this. You're thinking that the cost of the scheme is not only in your case, individually not worth the candle, game's not worth the candle, but also that it's too expensive for what you're getting, even if you were getting it?
Yeah, I think generally,
if you wanted it.
Yeah, it would be a matter of how it's being run, and could a more practical farming group run it more effectively, and I think it probably could.
If it's the Mosgiel people who, and they pay the other half of it,
yeah.
If there was a liaison group and it matters more to them, would you think that that should have Mosgiel people on it?
Yeah, I think you should. I think it needs
half and half. I think you
need to have representation, and since the scheme was reviewed, Hillary, and back in 2012, and then there was another review in 2015. I mean, my observation is Mosgiel's grown hugely in that time, and it's got its own set of issues. But I think if the integrated, remember these assets were put into play, I think, was 1908, so almost well over a century ago, if my math is right. And with the fact in mind that the whole community benefited. So I'm sitting there as a farmer paying $50,000, wondering about the flood free that goes along there and all those people that use the airport, wondering about the growing town that's Mosgiel, wondering about the sheep and beef farmers that send water down off the Mungatuas and off the Saddle Hill onto the plain, and why all of a sudden is the economic benefit so heavily in my favour, and therefore I've got to pay the cost. It just doesn't make sense.
So have you been told that there will be any consultation about the review process?
Well, at the moment, I'm not even sure that you've agreed there will be a review process. You've asked council staff, I think, to come back with review options. So to me, you're still one step off where you even are, but we are even deciding what makes up that review and what the consultation process is. My view is you need to get farmers alongside executive early, to scope out the review and get agreement around who's going to undertake it, because then you'd have practical input into it. and then B, have their input along the way, and then listen to what they say as a result of the review.
So you'd like to be part of a process about the pre-review, the what questions should be asked
Yeah, well,
and what about it?
yes.
You'd like...
Yep. As you're developing up the scope for the independent review, consulting with the stakeholders, in terms of the scope of that review, I think does a couple of things for council. It means that no one can come back at you later on saying, well, actually, I didn't agree with the scope of that review. And you can say, well, actually, you had input into its scope. And it means that actually the review might be something that goes to the heart of where the farmers' issues are.
So that would be your aim for today, to try and achieve that?
My aim for today is probably twofold. Yes, to achieve that, but also, get a sense of urgency around it. I mean, I know you've got a lot on, but the rating is going to be struck again, I assume, in the next sort of couple of weeks or whatever, or month or so. If the predictor's right, that's another $6,000 on my farm.
Thank you. Councillor Kelleher.
Thanks. Where are you getting to now with viability, given the escalation that you have from 7.3 to 5.3, and then rates are going to keep going up, and as we've predicted in our long-term plan, there's still some quite substantial increases to go. Speaking for not going into specifics of your own business, but speaking for the 20 other, say, farmers, is it reaching a point that's beyond viability, or is it sustainable? Because you've got DCC rates to stack on top of that as well.
Yeah, we do. Well, I don't really want to speak on behalf of 20 other farmers, but from my own situation, there's days that I sit there and think, well, should I just let it revert to wetland? And we've put 2 hectares of wetland out because actually I think it's the right thing to do. But and I'm probably a little bit unique in that regard because I've got other businesses that I don't really rely on the income of this. But you can't see those sort of magnitude of increases and not say it goes some way to impacting viability. And if I was an owner-operator on there, which on the Taieri there are a lot of owner-operators, I'd be under real stress at the moment, I would have thought. Commodity prices to one side, but they come and go.
Thank you.
Councillor New.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Ray. Just understanding, I understand why you're here. In terms of the review that you talked about, rating review, and you alluded to mosquito growing, etc. Are there any other factors within the catchment, or maybe not beyond the catchment, but any other factors that are influencing the whole situation with the need for a review?
In terms of what?
Well,
what's the...
if you look at the catchment, I suppose is the catchment fully rated currently, for example?
What?
And I'm talking Mangatua's further up, or is it confined to the lower land, basically?
Well, I'm not exactly sure how to answer that question because I don't quite know what the questions you're asking.
I mean, a targeted rate.
Yeah, so I suppose at the moment the area is ring fenced, obviously, and those ratepayers within that area pay the rate. Yeah. And whether you're paying a residential rate in Mosgiel or the Historic Fund Range Scheme, or you're a cocky, the area paying, like you've said, 6% of the total West Torrey one. What I'm saying is the scope of where the ratepayers currently exist, is it wide enough? Is my question.
Well, yeah, my answer is no. Just in its broader sense, going back to my point that this scheme was put in decades ago on the basis that it was dealing with a holistic catchment issue. And then all of a sudden, within, perhaps the farmers are to blame because they requested a review in 2012. And, I did have sort of comments that, well, you got what you asked for. But the fact of the matter is a community in Mosgiel, the sheep and beef farmers, of which the previous chairman was one up in the Mangatuas, they're all filling into that flatland catchment. And then all of a sudden, someone came up with, well, okay, we've got to assess the economic benefit, which is taking height from high area on the plain down to lower area of the plain and assuming that those on the lowest area will have the most benefit of the schemes that are in place. And to me, it's just that that's kind of fundamentally flawed, because there's a whole lot of relativities. And my example of, well, I'm quite happy for my farm to be underwater for 3 months. Doesn't really worry me that much. But if I'm a household in Mosgiel, and I think again around this forum people have talked about it being worth a cup of coffee for the sort of application to general rates over 10 or 15 or whatever Mosgiel is, 1,000 people. But if my house was underwater for 3 weeks, not 3 months in Mosgiel, then I've got a real problem, haven't I? So it's just, so the holistic answer to that is, yes, it's not wide enough, because if you're looking at the economic benefit, it falls on 20 ratepayers. And if you had the airport underwater for 3 months, then I think that would really highlight to wider stakeholders, not just on the Taieri Plain or in Mosgiel or in Dunedin, but those from Southland or Central Otago or wherever they come from that use the airport, or business people out of town. It kind of highlights me. So when I see the airport's paying $68,000 in rates and I'm paying 50, the relativity of that also doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Councillor Hobbs.
Yeah, but it's just about, thank you, Ray, it's just about the review process. Okay? Now, just then you said you wanted farmers to be part of this pre-review, pre-setting, the setting up of the review. Would you also include in that airport and representation of Mosgiel residents?
Yeah, so I thought...
Because the end product might be that they're affected.
Yeah, absolutely, and I might have been too long a winded answer to Hillary's question. Yeah, I think the stakeholders should have an input into that, and I guess just my interest is as a farmer, so I definitely want an input.
Thank you.
But you don't want people in Mosgiel or wherever opting out because they didn't get a chance to put some input into the scope.
Thank you. That's right.
Any other questions? I have one, and there are 2 reviews, as you said correctly. One is the review of the whole scheme. There's a performance review at the moment. Have you had any input yourself into that performance review with staff, any discussions?
No, and look, to be honest, I'm probably the wrong person, but there's people like Ian Bryan and practical people that have expressed to me, and don't just attribute this to Ian Bryan. There's farmers out there who are much more practical than me that have expressed issues that I think would have a good input into your executive looking at that right now, if they are looking at it now.
Okay, thank you. I just want to know, yeah. Thank you very much, Ray.
Okay, thank you.
Have a good day.
Yep, sorry to cut across your time.
Thank you very much for taking the time to come along.
No worries, I'll turn that off.
Thank you. Welcome to the confirmation of the agenda. I've got no notice of change or anything else that anyone else wants to talk about. The conflict of interests, I just remind you all that you need to stand aside from decision making when conflict arises between your role as an elected representative or any private or other external interests that you may have, or you need to declare them and manage them. We have now got a presentation from Dr. Gunn and Mary DeWitten, Diquat. They are going to talk to us, I think your request, Councillor Laws, about LINs and their work in the biosecurity and biodiversity. Welcome. Now, for those, this presentation is also on Diligent now. Thank you, Diane. Oh, Resource Centre. Thank you. Hello, welcome.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to speak here today. I'm Ine Isabe Gunn. I'm the Principal Advisor for Biosecurity and Biodiversity at Toitū Whenua LINs. And I'm joined today by Mary DeWinton, freshwater ecologist from Niwa. Mary is going to be managing the slides for us. So I will be asking her every now and again to change the slide for me. Now, the idea of today's presentation to you came about at our Lake Dunstan Weed Management Group meeting in May. There was a number of very good questions posed around our strategic approach to Lagora Siphon management across Otago and around why we're using different approaches at different sites. So Mary and I will try and address some of these questions here today. We'll take you through some quick basics about aquatic weed management that you may or may not be familiar with, cover our strategic approach across the region, and then dive into the specifics of our approach at Lake Dunstan. And hopefully there'll be a few minutes for questions at the end. Mary, if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. Just very quickly to touch on LINZ's role in aquatic weed management, we represent the Crown as owner of lake beds of Wanaka, Wakatipu and Dunstan, and therefore we're the lead government agency that are responsible for the management of these lake beds and some associated pests and weeds. So we all know we can't do biosecurity in isolation. So we've set up aquatic weed management committees at the various sites that we manage. And these bring together local stakeholders such as yourselves, councils, iwi, community groups, local industry, harbour masters, etc., to allow us to exchange information with people who are involved in or affected by other aspects of management of these water bodies. They help us become aware of local priorities and concerns and help us align operations and communications with these stakeholders to ensure better outcomes. Now, in order to deliver our aquatics program in Otago, we work with Boffa-Miskell, who manage our contractors on the ground that do the control work. And we work with NIWA, who are our scientific advisors that support us with inspection of the control works and advice on our strategic approach, which is why I have Mary here with me today to support this presentation. Can I have the next slide, please, Mary? This slide is just here to quickly put the problem into perspective. All the black dots indicate sites where we know Lagora Siphon to be present in New Zealand at the moment. In Otago specifically, it's found in Lake Wakatipu, the Upper Kawara River, Lake Wanaka, Clutha River, and Lake Dunstan. And I think the key takeaway message from this map is it is a widespread problem. It is not limited to Otago, but there are still water bodies in New Zealand that are free from Lagora Siphon, so we really need to do our best to protect them from invasion of this nasty aquatic weed. Next slide, please. Now, I'm sure you'll all be familiar with Lagora Siphon at this stage. It's an unwanted aquatic weed. Its trade is prohibited in New Zealand, and it's listed in the Otago Pest Management Plan under various site-led projects. The big problem with it is that it is a super spreader. It reproduces through tiny fragments of just a few millimeters. These fragments can disperse throughout the water or be transported across the land by boats and equipment and then settle in a suitable aquatic environment and invade that space and push out all the native biodiversity that might otherwise grow there. It has detrimental effects on native biodiversity, affects navigation and fishing, swimming, blocks water intakes, and of course the appearance, as we know, of the surface reaching weed beds and the debris that can wash up on the shoreline are certainly not adding to the appearance of our beautiful lakes. So by being so easily spread, Lagora Siphon, of course, poses a great risk to uninvaded water bodies, and a lot of our sites are within driving distance, so the risk of spreading it is very high. Next slide, please. So this is what I really want to get to, which is our strategic approach to Lagora Siphon management in Otago. LINZ manages Lagora Siphon at Lake Wanaka, Lake Wakatipu, the Upper Kawara River, and Lake Dunstan. Now, for each of these sites, we have 10-year management plans in place, which were developed by NIWA that set out a vision for the site, strategic goals, and these plans guide LINZ and our aquatic weed management groups on the best approach to Lagora Siphon at these sites. Now, I'll briefly take you through the approach followed at each of these sites to highlight the differences in approach across the region based on numerous factors. Now, if you look at Lake Wanaka at the top, Lake Wanaka has a 10-year plan in place since 2016, so we're about halfway through it, and we've seen some great progress at the site. Thankfully, the upper part of Lake Wanaka, the northern, more than half is pretty much free of Lagora Siphon. So the idea of the plan here is to really contain the spread from the southern side that has Lagora Siphon present and progressively remove Lagora Siphon from the lake. So for management purposes, we have the lake divided up into 3 zones: the northern eradication zone, which is virtually free of Lagora Siphon, then a buffer zone at the southern end, and a lower targeted control zone that has Lagora Siphon infestation. So the northern eradication zone is basically managed by surveillance and hand weeding. So we check that area based on a frequency associated with how risky we see it being that Lagora Siphon is reintroduced here. So that's pretty much maintained at a low cost, and we can direct more resources to the southern end of the lake where we have a Lagora Siphon problem. Now, the buffer zone contains some isolated plants, some narrow weed beds, some clumps of weed, and control within that zone really tries to minimize the volume and reduce the spread of Lagora Siphon into the eradication zone. So depending on the weed density in that area, we might be able to pull out the plants by hand weeding, or we might need to use other tools such as matting or herbicide to get on top of that spread there. Now, the targeted control zone at the very southern end of the lake, which has a lot of Lagora Siphon present, that's an area of progressive containment where we really try to use more tools such as herbicide and Hessian to control those denser weed beds. We really want to try to push the buffer zone further down south and expand the eradication zone over time. Now, we also check boat ramps, popular beaches, marinas regularly to make sure we reduce the spread of Lagora Siphon across the lake and to other sites within Otago. So that's our approach at Lake Wanaka. Lake Wakatipu and the Upper Kawerau also have a tenure management in place. Now, that plan only kickstarted in 2020. Our goal here again is exclusion and eradication of the weed from the lake, which is pretty much free of large established beds, and to progressively contain Lagora Siphon in the Upper Kawerau River where we have a problem with it. Same as for Wanaka, we conduct surveillance throughout the lake along shoreline units, depending on how high we deem the risk, and then control by hand weeding as necessary. The real problem in this system is the Upper Kawerau River, between the Kawerau Falls Bridge and the confluence of the Shotover River. For the purpose of our strategic approach, that Upper Kawerau River is divided into management units where we try to progressively contain Lagora Siphon in a downstream direction to reduce the weed there. And the risk is, of course, a lot of boats move between the river into the lake and back. So you have the risk of boats and equipment picking up weed and dragging it into the lake where we're trying to eradicate the weed. The challenge of this system is different because of the Kawerau River. So the riverine environment poses operational challenges for our control methods and for our divers. And it limits the contact time between the herbicide that we might use and the weed because of the water flow. And so we're doing the best we can with herbicide and matting in this area, but it is a really challenging environment. And we're really trying to look at how we can implement behavioral change to make people aware of the risk that they're posing if they move weed between the river and the lake with their boats and their equipment. Now, moving on to Lake Dunstan. This poses its own key challenges. It is downstream of these other systems that have Lagora Siphon, and at this stage it is fully saturated with Lagora Siphon, meaning that all the available habitat in this lake is already occupied by the weed. So again, we have a tenure management in place, started in 2016, and this plan, because of the situation at Lake Dunstan, is very much focused on the main sustained control of Lagora Siphon and to reduce the risk that Lagora Siphon poses to water-based recreation and uninvaded water bodies across Otago. Now, the management plan identifies 15 key sites in Lake Dunstan, which are identified as high-value areas in the Otago Pest Management Plan. And the ongoing management here is really about us making sure that we're on the same page with the council and the local community on which ones are, the key priority areas that should be maintained clear, how often should they be maintained clear throughout the year, and what outcomes are we seeking for these sites so we can focus our investment on maintaining the most important sites in this lake. That's my general overview of the approach across Otago. Mary will now take you through more specific detail at Lake Dunstan. Mary, over to you.
Thanks, Annie. So just to recap, Lagora Siphon was present upstream in Lake Wanaka before Lake Dunstan was even formed. So way back in 1993, the weed would be coming downstream and established very quickly in Lake Dunstan. It does very well at the lake margins and deltas such as Bendigo, and I've got a little clip here looking at an aerial view of Bendigo at the top of the lake. Showing the Lagora Siphon, it's the darker areas would be prime growing habitat for Lagora Siphon, and quite a big area up there. So Lagora Siphon can grow down to about 6 meters depth. It's not found in high flow areas. You can see that those channel areas are clear of any weed. It's not found, it's on steep rocky lake shores, and it's reduced where there's very high wave exposure, but there is substantial habitat that's available in Lake Dunstan for Lagora Siphon. Even nuisance weed, it's been predicted to occupy about 139 hectares of the lake. So Lagora Siphon is saturated in all habitat that's available in Lake Dunstan, and that means that we need to have the right tactics for that situation. The tactics at Lake Dunstan is sustained control. So this is an objective which seeks to reduce the impact of Lagora Siphon on the values of the lake, and also to protect other water bodies by reducing the risk of weed contamination and transfer on things like boat trailers, boats and other equipment. As already mentioned, the tactics are to identify the high value areas or high risk areas, and these are where there is high amenity value. It's usually the places that have the boat ramps, the jetties, pontoons and swimming platforms, and these are the real areas for focus of Lagora Siphon control. Just a little explanation around control tools that are available for Lagora Siphon. There's only a small number of control tools which are really applicable against aquatic, submerged aquatic weeds. And it's very, very important to match these management tools with the situation. So one of the aspects to take into account is the objective of management, and this could be whether it's eradication, progressive containment, or sustained control as it is in Lake Dunstan. The second consideration is the amount of weed biomass that is present. You can see here in the graph that the habitat saturated or high weed biomass is associated at the top right of this graph, and the associated tools, mechanical, grass carp, herbicide are also situated up here. And this is really the area that we are in for Lake Dunstan. The other control methodologies or control tools are really only applicable at limited sites in Lake Dunstan. So we just need to hold that in mind. I'm just going to run through the tools that are currently in use at Lake Dunstan, and the first one is the Diquat Herbicide.
Is it possible for this to be sent through rather than, or how long is it?
Is
it?
Yes. In resource centre, but you have to sync it. Sorry.
So is this going to be a long?
This is 30 minutes about. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yep.
That's what I missed. Sorry to interrupt.
That's fine. All right, so the most widely used tool at Lake Dunstan is the herbicide Diquat. Just an important point, this is not an eradication tool. This does not kill all the Lagora Siphon, but it reduces the biomass of the weed bed. So it will kill the young shoots, it will kill new buds, but it won't kill all the plant tissue of the Lagora Siphon. And I've got a photo here that shows a Diquat outcome at Northburn within the last year of operations. And this is really a gold standard outcome from herbicide, from Diquat herbicide. So it's knocked back the biomass just to sort of the bare twiggy stems of the plant. So effects like this can last for up to a year before the weed bed will eventually regrow. It certainly slows the growth of Lagora Siphon. It will take quite a time for the plants to re-establish those growing tips and grow away. The main benefit of Diquat herbicide is it can be applied to large areas very quickly. So a couple of days, you can treat sort of 50 to 100 hectares of weed bed. So it's also the cheapest control tool on an area basis. It's also an appropriate tool for controlling high biomass weed beds. There are two limitations to the use of Diquat herbicide. The first one is that the plants and water have to be clean. This is because Diquat herbicide is very, very quickly deactivated by any materials that are present in the water or on the surface of the plants. It just locks it up and deactivates it. The other requirement is that the herbicide has to be present in a sufficient concentration for a long enough time for the plants to take it up. And this is called a contact time. If those two aspects aren't met, then Diquat applications can fail to control Lagora Siphon. A little bit more about Diquat. It's a contentious issue. It's this particular herbicide registered for use in New Zealand, so it has been vetted properly. It's used within strict directions. Just to give you an idea, the dose for aquatic weed control is 1 part in a million of water of the active ingredient of Diquat. So that's 1 part per million, 1 ppm. The herbicide itself is applied to the water at a rate of 30 litres per hectare, and this achieves the 1 part per million Diquat within about half a metre of water. So you should be thinking of about 1 drop of the herbicide applied in a 10 litre pail of water. That's the sort of dilution that's required to get a target concentration. The herbicide can be applied by helicopter or it can be applied by boat into the water. And I've got a photograph there of a submerged boom delivering Diquat, which has been marked by a dye. So there are precautions that are undertaken after treatment with Diquat. Very important to notify the public and let them know what those precautions are, and they are very conservative in New Zealand. As I mentioned, there's rapid deactivation of Diquat. It disappears within hours to maximum of days, and there is no residual toxicity from Diquat. At the rates that it's used for aquatic plant control, it's not harmful to any other plant life, and even many native plants are either not affected by Diquat at all, or they are far less susceptible to Diquat than the target Lagora Siphon. To give you some more information, there are fact sheets that are available on NIWA's web pages. So moving on now to another tool which is used for weed control at Lake Dunstan, and this is mechanical cutting. Using a cutter bar mounted on a boat, and this cuts the near surface weed only. It does provide an immediate result at those places, but it is quite slow to apply, and it really can only be applied in limited areas. One of the issues is that the weed grows very rapidly from cut stems. There's nothing to stop its regrowth, and it only takes a few months for the weed beds to re-establish. There are commercially available, specific harvesting boats that can be purchased and used on lakes. Same sorts of issues. They can only be used in very slowly. It's limited in application in terms of the areas that can be used, and it's really unlikely that this mechanical cutting or harvesting can keep pace with the growth of the weed. There's also hand cutting by divers or weeding that's undertaken around the amenity structures in Lake Dunstan, so around boat ramps and jetties. It's really for very, very limited areas only, and again, it's temporary because there is rapid regrowth. It's incredibly challenging to keep some of these areas clear of the weed, and one example I'd give you is Butcher's Drive boat ramp. I've got a photo there of the ramps. This is a shallow, well-lit area, and Lagora Siphon grows back incredibly quickly. So I just want to touch on the tools that aren't currently used at Lake Dunstan, and the first one is Hessian bottom lining. Now this is the use of a jute matting which is laid over the top of the weed bed to smother it. It's not really applicable for very high weed biomass, very difficult to lay it in that situation, and the problem of a high fragment load really sort of rules this Hessian bottom lining out for Lake Dunstan. There's just too many fragments that can then re-establish on top of the Hessian bottom lining. It's not really applicable around amenity areas because it's a much slower method than the hand cutting that is currently used. I'll also mention grass carp. You might have heard of these. These are herbivorous fish that are stocked to lakes, and they eat pretty much all submerged vegetation. Not feasible in the case of Lake Dunstan because there's no way of keeping the fish actually in the lake itself. I also mentioned suction dredging, which is a tool that's been used in the past in some of the southern lakes. This is a Venturi suction tube, which divers feed the weed into, and it takes the weed up the tube and into a barge. For Lake Dunstan, there's no real advantage in removing the weed from the lake. And this methodology is actually slower than hand cutting. So again, it doesn't really have a place in the toolbox for Lake Dunstan. We'll make a comment too about future tools that we could add to the toolbox. And currently we do have a couple of areas that are relevant to Lake Dunstan that we have under our research program in Niwa. Firstly, we're looking at a new promising herbicide called Procelicor, which is registered in the United States. And this is a low rate herbicide. To give you an idea, this herbicide is targeted to weeds at rates in the parts per billion rather than parts per million for Diquat. And I've just got a photo there of one of our trials showing the effect that the herbicide had at a rate of 30 and 50 parts per billion, so very, very low concentration. This is a systemic herbicide, and so it's taken up by the plants and actually transmitted through the plant tissue. So it can reach parts of the plant which aren't in contact with the water. It's also got a very good safety rating. The other area of research that we're currently undertaking is with the gelling agent. So gelling agents are often applied to aquatic herbicides to help place the herbicide in the area that you want it. It's got an advantage that the gel weights the herbicide and makes it fall through the water column down to where the plants are that you want to treat. And it may improve the placement and also the contact of the herbicide with the plants. So we're currently investigating 3 formulations, including one which is actually currently in use. It's routinely used with, for example, helicopter applications to minimize spray drift. So that's really the crux there is looking for more tools for the toolbox, and particularly ones that are applicable to issues like Lake Dunstan. So I'll hand back to Eni now.
Great, thank you, Mary. So I think the key takeaway message here, and looking into the future, we see that we have a very limited toolbox that we're dealing with, and the suitability of these tools depends on a variety of factors, be it environmental, social, level of infestation, etc. We are hoping that that toolbox will be expanded, but as you can see, none of them will be an immediate silver bullet that can eradicate Lagora Siphon overnight. Something that, you know, I tried to show you here in this presentation is that we really need to take a strategic system-wide approach. We can't see any of these lakes or rivers in isolation. They're all connected, and Lagora Siphon just is a super spreader, which makes it very difficult to control. Key points to help us continue to manage this aquatic weed, I think, is to ensure the agreement by agencies and lake users on priority areas for control and the outcomes we're trying to achieve by what we're doing. And we need to continue to work together to support behavioral change. It's really imperative that users of these lakes and rivers understand how they can help mitigate the spread across and within water bodies to help us get on top of the weed. One example of how this is currently being done is the Check Clean Dry program led by MPI in partnership with Otago Regional Council, which aims at engaging the community to help prevent the spread of aquatic weeds such as Lagora Siphon. But of course, there's always more that can be done with regards to communication and education. At this stage, I would like to say thanks to our partners who help us realize this aquatic weed management program. Especially in Otago, we obviously have Otago Regional Council, Contact Energy, QLDC, and all of our stakeholders that dedicate their time and support to the weed management committees. So thank you for your time, and please let us know if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Eni and Mary. That was breathtakingly interesting, but slightly disturbing. Disturbing, yes. Thank you. We've got some questions. I hope you're both happy to take some right now.
Yes,
so,
please.
Councillor Hobbs.
Thanks, dear. It's just, I don't know much about grass carp. So why are you worried about grass carp moving out of Lake Dunstan?
Yeah, it's really around the effective weed control that grass carp can provide. They've got to be contained. They've got to, in order to exert pressure on the vegetation, they've got to be contained in a system. And because the grass carp have very strong migratory instincts, they will hightail it out of somewhere and try and find it, somewhere else to live. And unless you've got them contained in the area, they're not exerting that browsing, that grazing pressure on the target weed that you want.
So it's not their chocolate, they don't want to stay there.
No.
We've got a question online from Edward, if I can do that first. I think the question was something about toxicity of...
The gel is toxic.
Yeah, about the gel toxicity, please.
Just to clarify, you mean the gelling agent that's applied with the herbicide?
Yeah, the additive.
The additive? Sure. It's actually based on guar beans, so it's like the material that's used as a thickener in the food industry. So it's you find it in ice creams and such like. It's a natural product. The one that's currently used has a natural derived product.
Thank you.
Councillor Forbes?
Yeah, I've got a few worries. It's really quite a disturbing presentation, but I'm thinking like I was disturbed to see Lake Whakatipu up there as a lake that has Lagora Siphon now, because we're only just admitting that really in recent, maybe 2-3 years, because 4 years ago maybe, it was free from Lagora Siphon. And what my question, and Wanaka, again, I was disturbed to hear that Wanaka might have any Lagora Siphon at all in its northern zone, because it never used to. But now it's being described as virtually free. So it looks to me that in both of those Great Lakes, the situation is deteriorating, and that may or may not be the case, but I'd like to know if it is or not. And secondly, how are the management plans on target at all if in fact these are deteriorating? So are they deteriorating more slowly than they would have if we'd done nothing? But it is deteriorating, is that correct?
I'll let Mary pick up the question of a no control scenario in a second. With regards to the deterioration, I would say that what we've been seeing in recent years is an increase in boat traffic, an increase in lake users, particularly in the Kawarau River. So we have a lot of traffic moving from the river into the lake. And often the areas where we do find plants within the lake are closely linked to boat movement. So they might be marinas or sites of boat ramps, or camping areas or very popular beaches. So it's very likely that those plants that we do find within the lakes that should be free are coming from boats that are moving between the infested area in the same lake or in other lakes and spreading it there. So I think that's why we're seeing these plants in areas that should be virtually free.
So that is a deterioration?
Mary, what would you say over time? Has that increased significantly?
For Lake Whakatipu, I think it has been a recent thing, and I think it is a reflection of the amount of traffic that's coming up from the river. But for Lake Wanaka, we've seen some real progress. So what I would say is that eradication is being achieved. It's being achieved each year. There is ongoing drift from the southern end of the lake, drift of fragments into the eradication zone, but eradication is still being achieved in that northern area.
So what's the sense, supplementary Chief, what's the sense of the management plan then in Whakatipu and how that might achieve eradication?
Yes, certainly we've got goals, objectives and some milestones that are formulated in the management plan. It is an early stage. As Eni said, the management plan we put together was started in 2020. Probably want a little bit more time to see sort of how it's going. I think there's a review. We've definitely got a review that's set in the management plan at 5 years, but we also undertake an annual review with the stakeholders as to how things are going.
With regards to the Wanaka management plan, which is about halfway through its 10 years now, we've done a progress review on how we're tracking with regards to milestones, and there I would say we're very much on track. We've seen some great results at Wanaka. We've cleared a lot of shoreline as was planned within the management plan, and we are on track to meeting our further milestones there. There's been minimal deviation within that plan that I can remember off the top of my head with regards to, if you remember, we have the eradication zone at the top, then we have a buffer zone, and then we have the target control zone at the bottom. The plan was to push that buffer zone further down, expand the eradication zone, and we've done that in a slightly different area than we envisioned because we were making great progress at one area with the Hessian matting. So I think there's one milestone where we just haven't cleared the area we envisioned. We cleared a different area instead based on the conditions we found at the lake.
And just finally for Lake Dunstan, it looks like we don't really have the tools to be doing much with Dunstan, and it looks like we're just cutting the lawn every now and again. Is that probably correct?
Dunstan is really that different approach because of the situation of it being downstream and it being saturated. We don't have an area where we can just push back because of the saturation of the system, and we constantly have that reinvasion as well. So the management plan is very much about figuring out what are the high use sites or the high value sites or the high risk sites and keeping them at a manageable level. So cutting the weed down or using herbicide to knock down those weed beds for up to a year to ensure that people can either safely use that space or to reduce the risk of spreading it from that area. So it is more of keeping on top of it at high use or high value or high risk sites. It is definitely not the same kind of approach that we can take in the other rivers and the other lakes where we have areas that have virtually none or very low Lagora Siphon that we can push back on.
Thanks. Thank you for your patience.
No, Councillor Noon and then Councillor Laws.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you very much for the presentation. Excuse me. My question was just around suction dredging seemed to be the poorest option. I just wondered whether that would be the case if there was the ability to work with contact, for example, if there were programs to reduce silt build-up, that sort of thing. Would that be a possibility in your management plan in the future?
Mary, can you comment on that?
Right. Yes, I'm trying to envisage. I probably can't comment without knowing what is planned in terms of contacts activities, in terms of suction dredging or removal of siltation. So it's a little bit hard for me to answer.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that either. It's something we can look into, but I couldn't comment on the approach there at the moment.
Councillor Laws.
Hi, it's Michael Laws here. A couple of observations first of all. I mean, the issue with Lake Dunstan has got much worse over the last 4 or 5 years. And the spread of Lagora Siphon has now spread all the way from Lake Dunstan proper down the sort of river part all the way to the Clyde Dam, and also populated all of the little eddies like Champagne Gully and places like that. I'm sure you're aware of that. So really the Lagora Siphon management plan for Lake Dunstan has failed. And
I don't think that's quite the case. We do have quite good descriptions of Lagora Siphon extent going back to the late 90s, and there's no indication that there's been an expansion in Lagora Siphon. It was already present all around the lake. So I'm not sure that I can agree with the fact, your statement there.
That's just not true. And no one there who lives with that at all. Having Councillor Callagher also nod his head on that too. But I also wanted to talk to you about the Procella core, which seems the only potential remedy. How far is that away from getting approval in New Zealand for application?
Right. I can't say how far away it is. all I can state is that we have investigated the herbicide here under New Zealand conditions and against New Zealand targets, and it is looking promising. In terms of registration, there is a process that it would have to go through with New Zealand EPA, and I can't comment on how long that process will take. It depends on too many factors.
Well, so who's in charge of taking it through EPA?
I'm unclear on that, Michael.
Yeah, it could be, we can't really comment on that. It could be a consortium if there was interest. It could be, you know, an agent bringing that herbicide into the country.
Thank you. We've got an expert locally who's going to give us an answer as well. The CEO comes from that neck of the woods.
Yeah, used to look after Hessian as part of my former work. I mean, yeah, anyone can take an application to bring a chemical in to the EPA and have it assessed. So
ORC could do that.
Yes, regional councils have done that previously, grouped together in the past.
So is there a potential for us then to do that, or would you do that?
I could imagine that having a concerted effort from the various agencies involved might be a wise way to go, Michael. It's definitely something we should look into and consider what's the most effective approach if it should be filed by one agency or if it should be filed by several. I don't know if that gives it more push.
Well, I mean, here we are, you're here, we are sort of wanting to get involved. We've put aside money in our long-term plan this financial year for looking at lake management. This would seem to be a classic time, surely, to cooperate, wouldn't it?
Oh, there's always the right time for cooperation, and now is definitely a good time. Yeah, I think that's definitely something to progress as we're, you know, you were part of the meeting when we reviewed the plan and discussed that we really need to revisit all of these goals and what the next steps are in light of the current situation. So I think that's definitely one of those steps that we should progress this year and figure out how to proceed.
Excellent. And finally, our harbour master was also present in that meeting. He made a very salient observation. He said that Lake Dunstan is so easily accessible from so many points that people don't necessarily use the ramps to launch and unlaunch there. So that means that it's so easy to take Lagora Siphon out of Lake Dunstan and transfer it to Wangatipu and to Wanaka and indeed any other lakes in our area.
And vice versa.
Yeah. So is there anything, I mean, given that that's been highlighted by him, and he's actually also pointed out there are now navigational issues as a consequence of the Lagora Siphon. Is there a sense of urgency at your end on this?
I think absolutely the risk of transferring it is huge. The question is of how do we, you know, we control the lake beds, we don't control the access of people to the lake, and I don't have clarity on how we could progress on that front. I envision that this might be something where we would need to also work with council and understand what could be done, because I remember the harbour master highlighting this issue and saying he doesn't quite know how we would stop people because of the large areas that are accessible. It's not one area where we might put some boulders or restrict access. So it would be really important to understand, is there anything we can do? I think it's absolutely front of mind because, you know, as we can't solve the problem completely at Dunstan right now and eradicate overnight, we will have this ongoing risk of transfer from there and to other lakes in the area. So just like highlighting to people what the risk is and what they can do to mitigate the spread, also limiting access would be fantastic. It's just the question across the breadth of the lake, how can we tackle that? Is that even possible?
If I could take your question further. So would it be helpful for us to ask our council legal team what powers we have under section 147, I think it is, of the Local Government Act, to do a bylaw that could preclude access to parts of a lake if there were work happening in order to ensure that the exclusion could or maximise the benefit basically, and slowly work your way through the lake that way? Would that?
I think any understanding we can get about how and if we could restrict access. So in some of the other lakes where we're asking a similar question, such as Lake Wanaka, where we have invested a lot, let's say in Hessian matting, and we have a lot of boaties coming in and damaging the matting because they don't know it's there, or they don't care, or don't see the issue with throwing their anchor in or throwing their fishing gear in there. So it's a lot about communication and education as well. But then there's obviously the side of trying to understand of is there something that the council could do to restrict access? I don't myself know what the regulations are and what the powers of the council there are, or what the social license for that would be.
The social license to us not to go places now is slightly greater than it used to be.
Absolutely.
We can thank COVID for many things. Councillor Hoke.
Thank you. I'm not sure.
There's some other mics.
There we go. Sorry, ladies, I'm not sure, and it might be a Mrs. Gardner question here. If we look at the picture of the jet boat and the jet ski on the trailer, and you've got the three people looking underneath it.
Yeah.
And it says check, clean, and dry. Now, so they're checking it underneath because this is a good point here I'm trying to raise. Now it's got clean. So what happens if they find that underneath? This is probably something that I'd like to explore, because do they say to that person, clean it, this is how we do it, and then we're not leaving here until this is dry, or then is that person then tagged to know that there's been problems, like you say, from the Koara into to Lake Wakatipu? How does this part then go? Because what's to stop that transferring once that's left here? And how much of a emphasis is actually put back on that person who owns that jet ski?
Yeah.
What can anyone tell us? You know, how far do we go?
Across the room, because I think, Andrea, how many are you in a position?
Probably might like to.
Or Gavin?
I completely agree. It is, Check Clean Dry is very much an awareness raising campaign of what you can do to reduce your equipment, your trailer, your boat from spreading any of these tiny fragments to another lake system or river system. It's very much on the boat owner to actually stick to that and do it. They need to actually be effective, use the right technique. Then the question is where and when do they do this? It is a challenge in the way of everybody knows how busy boat ramps are. There are not necessarily areas set aside for this, or the tools and the space for them to do this. So while the program is very important and fantastic, and providing this education and teaching people about how they should be doing this, actually having the owners implement it is definitely a challenge. Mary, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I guess in New Zealand, we haven't gone down a sort of regulation type approach. They definitely have in the United States, where lakes like Lake Tahoe, there are quite onerous requirements for boat owners to get their vessels inspected. There are fines if they haven't had their vessels properly inspected, or if there's anything found on their vessels. So we're a bit behind the 8 ball in terms of our practices here. I think it comes back to, you know, everybody values our backyard, our lakes, and, you know, free reign and free access to them without thinking about consequences. So it is an education system, education requirement that we're looking for here.
Thank you. I think we've got Andrea to. Andrea.
Through the chair. So yes, I would obviously agree with much of what's been said. So in terms of what OIC is actively doing, and be able to expand this program with our increased resources. So we collect a whole lot of information around people's attitudes and understanding of the problem at the moment. So I think we did, from memory, about 800 surveys of people in last summer across all of the water bodies impacted. So we then share that information with various groups and organisations that can help with that behavioural change. We also do some event-based demonstration activities in terms of what clean, check, dry looks like, and how people can make sure that they're using the right techniques and methods, and there's definitely potential to expand that into kind of practical one-on-one advice to boat users, and that we can do further as well.
Thank you. Edward, did you have any questions? I apologise for missing you with Ray Parker, but I'll come back to you on that directly.
Yeah, no, it's all good, thanks. No, appreciated the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Dicot had a question.
Yeah, thank you. Early in your presentation, you showed a dot map of where Lagora Siphon was a problem across New Zealand. And I noticed that there seem to be some lakes which are popular with boaties, there we are, which seem not to have infestation at all, unless I've got that wrong. And I wondered what they're doing there that has been so successful at either keeping it out or getting rid of it if it's been there. I can see, for example, that Tekapo, Pukaki, Manapori, Hiroko seem to have no dots according to your map. Are they naturally Lagora Siphon free, or do they have management regimes that have actually been effective?
They certainly don't have management regimes with us right now. This is Mary's map, so she can maybe comment better on the history here of these other sites. Were they just never invaded, Mary?
No, never invaded. I think it's a sort of a use thing. So we certainly have modelled the distribution of these weeds and found that they are closely aligned to proxy factors for attraction of lakes to humans. So, you know, things like what's the grade of the road to the lake, what's the size of the lake, what's the number of roads, how close is the nearest highway, things like that did associate quite nicely with our risk map of where things were found. So I think it's just primarily just good luck that these lakes haven't been infested. There may also be, for those upper Waitaki lakes, they're naturally quite turbid because of the glacial flow that comes down their systems. So it might not be quite such a good habitat for Lagora Siphon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Laws and then Councillor Hope.
Sorry, I've just I'm sure you're aware, Mary, but I don't know if both of you are aware that the Northern Regional Council has successfully eradicated Lagora Siphon from 2 dune lakes. And you're nodding your head, Mary, you are aware.
Yes.
What are the mechanisms there, or what are the lessons there that we could apply here?
Right. I think I would stress that these are small lake systems, and what has been undertaken there is a whole of lake treatment with another herbicide. The other herbicide that's registered for use in New Zealand is called endothol, and it's a effective herbicide for eradication of Lagora Siphon and possibly for hornwort as well, when it's present for a very long time at a sufficient concentration. So they've actually had special dispensation to use that herbicide for the whole of the lake, treat the whole of the lake, and that's been sufficient to eradicate, Lagora Siphon from a couple of the lakes.
Yeah.
When you're talking about a lake like Lake Dunstan, I guess the water volume alone is going to be challenging to do a whole of lake treatment, such as been undertaken in Northland.
The alternative, though, is perhaps even worse, isn't it? That is that it continued to be used as a source of potentially further infection of other lakes in the Otago region.
The challenge you also have with endothol, I think we touched on this previously, so I'm sorry for maybe repeating this, but it needs to be kept in contact with the herbicide longer than Diquat. Mary will correct me if I'm wrong with this.
No, you're right.
Especially in sites such as, if we're not talking just about Lake Dunstan, but other sites that are infested in Otago, such as the Upper Kawerau, if you have a lot of water flow, we're not quite sure yet how we can contain endothol in that column of water for long enough to contact the weed. So if there is water flow, that's something where endothol is not, we don't have a method for that yet. There is things being tested of how we could contain it for a longer time, but it does need to be in contact with the weed for a lot longer than Diquat. So that is one of the challenging factors of using endothol and some of the other sites that have more water moving through them than just being a small, more static piece of water.
Okay, last question as we're running out of time and stuff being held up.
It was just really asking a question, thank you, through the chair, and I was building on what Councillor Hobbs just talked about, coldness, cold weather, and that, and what Councillor Dicot said, but like for Hiroko, where you've got the deepest lake in New Zealand, is that a reason to why it hasn't gone there? As opposed to our lakes here?
It certainly wouldn't stop Lagora Siphon from establishing. Very, very wide tolerances of that plant. It could establish in very, very high number of water bodies in New Zealand. It's just luck that it hasn't been introduced with the number of fragments or the number of occurrences sufficiently for a fragment to establish.
Thank you.
Thank you. That has been a outstanding presentation. Anyone listening to it has learned a lot, I'm absolutely sure. It will challenge us to see what more we can do to assist in that program, but that's not something for today. So, but I'm sure someone will put in motion at some stage to consider what we could do in bylaws and possibly with some more columns on that. So thank you very, very much, Dr. Gunn and Mary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having us. Thank you for your time.
That moves us on to the confirmation of the minutes from the 7th of July meeting. Thank you. You're moving, Councillor New?
Yes,
moving the confirmation. Seconded. Thank you, Councillor Hope. Any discussion or questions thereof? If all are happy, I'll say aye.
Aye.
Against, carried. Thank you. I saw the nod, Edward. The outstanding actions from is page 7. We've got a integrated Otago Trail network investigation that's gone ahead. The letter that has now gone to the DCC, that's referred to in the minutes.
On the 4th of the 8th.
Yeah, so that's in progress. So while it says it's overdue by 156, we've actually just done that in the last few weeks. So
confirmed a meeting time with the city as well, on the 31st of August.
Well done. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Have you got people going with you on that? That's all sorted. Thank you. Excellent. So it's not looking as bad as it may seem. I'd just like to note that. No other comments on those matters or discussion? Then we'll go to matters for consideration. Sylvie and Connor. Thank you very much for your waiting around. I hope you all enjoyed the...
All right, it was interesting.
It is. And on behalf of Gretchen, who can't be here, but who assisted on this, the work getting up to speed to put this submission on, I'm really grateful not only to the input that we've been given the chance to do, both Gretchen and myself and all of us as the emails went round, but also the collaboration with the TAs. A huge amount of work. It was in time poor, so thank you to the staff. Have you got any comments? Do you want us to talk about anything in particular, or you're happy to take it as read?
No, happy to take it as read. Just noting that following the last Strategy and Policy Committee, where you approved the fact that the co-chair of the Strategy and Policy Committee approved the submissions, we've gone through the development of those submissions with your input from a large round of staff within ORC, and collaboration with the other city district councils. So I would like to acknowledge the input from everyone. It's been a collective effort, and it's
Question.
Thank you, Councillor Hobbs.
Just a question. I truly couldn't understand things, sorry. The first bit, which goes up comments inquiry, and it talks about all the councils involved.
just which section?
That is vastly different in tone from the one that is ORC. Can you explain why the difference in tone?
I'm not sure that I know exactly what you mean, but those submissions have been reviewed, especially the joint submission. It has been reviewed by all planning managers, So it's really been the result of a collective effort. So it's probably why it's quite different.
It's more than us.
It's more than us, yes,
Okay.
yes, absolutely.
Camel made by committee.
It's not too bad, actually.
It's bloody dreadful. So there's a second question that comes in there almost automatically, is that this actually asks for a person to speak to the select committee.
Yes, it does.
Are they speaking on the ORC or on both submissions?
On ORC's behalf, that's what we are asking for this committee. We don't know yet who will be speaking on behalf of the of all the other councils.
Maybe that we get involved the two chairs of the two meal forums.
Okay, who's the two chairs?
Tim Killian is ours. I'm sorry, I forget who thousands.
Can you make just a suggestion on that?
If you want to move and put the name in there, you're more than welcome to, or...
I don't want to put a name in there. I just want to make sure, and I've almost got a preference. Having sat on many a select committee, and I know that other people have had 2 or 3 years doing the same thing, but having done that, that we don't put up somebody who really can't argue every paragraph of this. Because if you really want to make points across, you have to know your law, and you have to know the submission and understand it paragraph by paragraph. I'm beginning to suggest that it should be staff going up there if we really want to make a difference.
Or Zoom in. Thank you. Sorry, yeah.
Oh, can I just add to that? Having spent 6 years on the select committee,
I
I have to
before you
say
throw it
that
out.
the chairman, I think, is mandatory to go. And usually in cases like this, you find the chairman goes, Sarah, and then your technical staff being quiet. But it's important that the chairman is there representing the ORC. It is a political forum at the end of the day. That's what it comes down to.
Have you got any advice to us on that? And the question is it limited to one person, or can we send, we could send a council team?
If you want.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't get 10 persons.
No.
I know.
There's only seats for 3 at the end of the table if you're lucky.
There will be
Zoom now.
And the allocation will only be 10-minute slots per organisation, so there will be quite a limited time.
Okay. Are there any questions on the? I'm happy to take them in parts. Sorry. Okay, Councillor.
Yeah.
Yes, Scott. Thank you.
It was just in relation to the environmental bottom lines, and there seemed to be some negative comment around the promotion, the strong focus of environmental bottom lines as opposed to environmental outcomes. But I did see, I read somewhere, and as we do on this council, we also say that if we can improve our limits if we need, for example, our lakes, and if we don't want to diminish that standard. I see environmental bottom lines as a positive thing. So why is it sort of couched in a negative way?
No, so the point that we're making is absolutely environmental bottom lines are very positive, and I think that's one of the strengths of the NBA exposure draft is to actually require environmental bottom lines and set a purpose to these environmental bottom lines. Do
you say that in your submission?
Yes, we do.
I read it. I just didn't see stuff as strong as what you just said.
I like to find the paragraphs. That said, we have two concerns with the environmental bottom lines. One is that because there's such a focus on environmental bottom lines, and when you compare the NBA exposure draft with what the Randerson's panel recommended, there's far less focus on outcomes and achieving positive environmental outcomes. So the issue that this focus could trigger would be to manage down to bottom lines rather than up to outcomes. So that was one of the things that we wanted to highlight, whether there should be a more balanced focus. And the other one is that as drafted, there seems to be, the NBA exposure draft seems to restrict the ability of the planning committees to tailor the environmental bottom line to the region. So the national planning framework, it's the government which will prescribe how much discretion planning committees will have into tailoring the environmental bottom lines. And what we want to make sure is that regions keep the ability and the discretion to set environmental bottom lines as are needed in the region.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, carry on.
No, thank you for that. And we've had this negative comment about the RMA for quite a period of time. And now they've come out with this other option. But, you know, the local councils are generally coming out critical. They're saying, you know, they've got this whole investment in terms of the RMA. Why should we move away from it? I thought there was a general agreement that the RMA did need to be significantly changed. I mean, we're part of that council saying that I think, you know, our ORC is in the list of councils that's basically defending status quo.
That's too big a question for this. I don't think the staff can be expected to engage with that question, really, Brian.
So, yeah, fair enough. I wasn't asking you.
I'm on behalf of the staff trying to say I don't think
the question is,
what is the question? Well, it's not a question, but I'm happy to ask her a question.
Yeah. And it's a nice political statement. The question I have is for this chair. Have you had any discussions?
And what was it going to get us or not?
What's the question? Sorry?
Well, didn't the councils basically coming out and were trying to defend that they said there were issues. There was such an investment in the RMA that there was concerns about significantly changing it. Wasn't that? Did I read that somewhere?
Yeah, I think there is a comment on that, but I think the point is, yes, then there is a need for resource management reform, but you need this resource management reform to result in a significant improvement of the system. If it's just changing it without having it much better, then is it worthwhile doing all the investment around changing your plans and reshuffling them if you don't have a...
Cool.
Yeah.
They were our plans.
The question is, did you read something? And their proper answer was, you may have, Councillor Scott.
Sorry, I'm going to go back to the chair of the meeting. Please.
I think the other point too that was raised in the submission was around everybody seeing the midstream, you know, reviewing their documents, or you know, they've just notifying like ourselves and RPS, and I suppose they were just highlighting that regardless of when change comes, you know, there's still an investment that's required. I suppose they were just raising that there's probably never going to be a good time to change because we've got to continue on with some sort of planning regime and continue to review those planning regimes.
I think the other part of that was that there are some terms in technology, terminology that is well understood in the RMA, that if you change that terminology for no great purpose, you actually have a huge fun fight of legal cases working out what the law's implications are. And I think that's the sort of thing that they said, if you don't need to change some things, don't change it.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Now, the question of you, Chairman, is are you happy or have you had any discussions at the Otago Mayoral Forum about who will be speaking to this, the joint submission?
No, not at this point.
When have you got the Mayoral Forum next? And the question then is, should we be saying that we delegate to the chair to either represent us or to ensure that
But are we just dealing with that?
We're just going to be dealing with that one. Yeah. Okay.
So the other one will take care of itself.
Yeah. Okay.
I think. So with regards to the second recommendation.
Yeah. You're happy to do that?
Yeah, more than happy. Last time I spoke with, it was to the Clean Waters Committee. There was 2 staff with me, so
that's right.
And they wrote a submission for me.
Yeah, great.
Etc. So the support is there, which is fantastic.
So you indicated to Councillor Lawsey you're happy to move that with
I'll second it.
With the chair's name in there. Thank you. Thank you. Moved to seconded. Any further questions or discussion? Yes, Councillor Hoyt.
Sorry, I just want to ask a question.
Sorry, apologies.
No, it's okay. And it just comes under slightly different. This is on page 22, and we have the box, and you have 8 to 14, and then you've got a signature for Lagora City Council. Now, when you have that, I just want to be clear in my thoughts here. That's solely to do with that city, because the box isn't always for everybody. I've noticed like these tracing facts above. So I'd like clarity on this. There's 21, 20, you don't have the box, but you have it, as I say, if you go forward, that small box of revise the draft through to 14 design.
It's just the way they've printed it.
So is that just the way?
Yeah, it's just where it has been signed by.
So they all signed that box.
That's what I thought. I just that's the way it reads. And then may I just ask a point of clarity on number 11 in the box? We talk about the importance of quality housing and good urban design for people and community well-being. Would I take that also to be good urban design? Does that drill down into things like transportation as well in that urban design?
It would, yes, in terms of infrastructure. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Yes. One point. There's a good reference in here to read on exposure draft bills, which I wish had been read by the TAs, because it says it is not about the detailed wording. This comes under Legislation, Design and Advisory Committee. It's very worthwhile reading, because this government is doing this more and more, particularly on technical bills, to get the principals understanding it, to see if there's agreement about the basic principles and direction, and then you do the detail. Yeah, and it's I think we've only got about 8 weeks for this, and either chairing it or it's definitely deputy chair is the person who came and spoke to us. Rachel, thank you.
Thank you. Edward.
Thank you, Kate. I think it's okay. I was referring to the cover paper, which didn't refer to the principles of the treaty, but I think it's got talking about the principles of the actual submission, so it's probably okay. I think it's a very good cautionary submission, but going forward, yeah.
Thank you, Edward. The staff are nodding their heads to your concern, which I think should give you some. Lynn, did you have your?
Oh, it's just because Edward was.
Oh, Edward, sorry, you were doing hand signals. I'm now listening. I want to ask the motion. I don't know how to put the motion under his name if he's no longer in the room.
I've seconded it.
I'll move it. Well, we've got a second, so do you want to move in for a second by you? How about that?
Okay.
Calvert and Hobbs. I don't know that we can move something to the left. It's uncomfortable. So if you have move Calvert, second Hobbs. Any further discussion? Do you wish to speak to the motion?
Just very briefly, I understand the government's desire to run it up the flagpole and see who salutes it in general. But the devil does, in the end, rely on the detail. And it's sort of like saying, do you think people eat too much sugar? And when you get agreement from them, say, okay, you've agreed and you're supporting a sugar tax. It might be, or it might not be. But just because we think people eat too much sugar doesn't mean we want the effective result. So I think that it has to have, and our staff have, I think, very appropriately, and the other organisations, put out a word of caution about it not having enough detail to give an idea of quite where it's going. I think that's really what a lot of the submission comes down to. We don't know quite where this is, and we're not even sure whether we disagree with it, perhaps, or if it was there. So I think it is appropriate to have words of caution and things about something that hasn't yet been fully fleshed out. I do understand exposure documents, but I think that it is worth having that sort of detail, and thank you very much for I think that these are excellent.
I would like to thank the staff very much for the work. I think the unfortunate is the way it's been picked up as being negative, because I think having exposure draft is a relatively new thing for a lot of us to be involved in.
Civil Aviation. We did it for Civil Aviation Act.
Sorry, it's still relatively new for people around the table about that, and for a lot of people in the industry. So I think it's a welcome change that when people get a chance to do this, but it shouldn't necessarily be seen as a negative thing that people have submitted. It is what the process is about. And I think that the staff have done a really well-worded submission. Thank you very much for your work. And to do it in a relatively short time with the TAs, it was an onerous task. So thank you. And on that basis, I'm going to put the motion. All in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you very, very much for your attendance. We are about to sign off to all the YouTubers. Yeah, I'm going to come back to Edward about Mr. Parker. Is that okay? He's not here at the moment, so we're just going to sign off from the YouTubers and thank you very much for your attendance today. Thank you. We won't see you again at Strategy and Planning, but best wishes at the university. But I think we'll be here for council next week. Fortnight. Well done. Thank you, Molly. Thank you. Thank you. We're now going into non-public briefly. Thank you very much, Sylvie. Thanks, Winner. YouTubers are gone. Oh, we didn't have. We'll put this up online. Thank you. Edward, sorry, I missed you with Ray. What was your question? You've emailed me through. Great. I can deal with that later. I have to deal with it now.
Yeah, sorry. Well, I think it needs to go. It needs to go. Okay.
Sorry, I presumed it.
Sure. Am I okay to speak now? Okay.
Thank you. Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks. Look, there was interesting cordial from Mr. Parker, and I'm aware of the issue. I'm also aware of Ian Bryant's issue there. In fact, I think he submitted to the long-term plan. He's caught in the floodplain area. He's also whānau. What was of interest to me is that Mr. Parker may not be aware that there's a considerable Ngāi Tahu interest down there as well. So all I'm flagging is that if there is a review as a precaution, we would want to be in the loop on that. The flood protection vaporised our community there.
No, thank you very, very much for that. And I think I'm very glad in that case that we had the discussion here around this table when you are present to make sure that that happens. So that's fabulous.
I don't think you were thinking, Edward, for the last comment that he made. Yeah.
What?
What did you say, Edward, your last sentence, that the flood protection...
The 1908 Act and subsequent acts vaporised our community.
Yeah, you vaporised the community, so it's quite a significant statement. Yeah.
I'm thanking him for bringing up exactly what Ian Bryant brought up twice to us now, and we haven't acted.
No, that's fine.
Ian Bryant was really clear that they've moved several times. No, I'm not. I'm very glad that he's consistently bringing up what's already been brought to us to act on. So I was thanking him. Thank you. I've now got just the minutes of the non-public part of the previous meeting. I'm happy to move them. The public